All right. Well, good evening. It's Sunday evening, and I'm recording this lecture for the economics class. It's a lecture on the history of government involvement in the United States economy in the 20th century, although I think I'll be able to take it up to a little bit of the 21st century. And like I said, it's a history lecture as well as an economics lecture, or you could call it a lecture on economic history. One of the big themes of studying economics and dealing with economics is, how and in what ways or to what extent should the government be involved in a market economy? And this lecture speaks to those issues kind of indirectly by giving you this brief, but I hope helpful lecture about what has happened in the past 110 years or so on this question. So I'm going to get into screen share here. Should have done this a little bit earlier, but better late than never. So here we go. And time to bring up a piece of paper to take some notes on. I don't have any pictures for you, I'm sorry to say. You'll just have to make do with my voice and the notes that I take, but I still hope to find this reasonably interesting. Bring that up. Use a slightly bigger font. Okay. So, okay. Government involvement. And a little bit beyond the 20th century as well. Okay. And some of this stuff will be familiar to you from your 9th grade history class, or maybe from your 10th grade history class with me. But a little repetition is actually a good thing, because hopefully it'll help you remember those things a little bit better. Plus, I'm sure there'll be some new information that's new to you. All right. Well, what I do is present a series of periods in the history of the 20th century. And our first period, you will, I hope, recall from 9th grade, is the Progressive Era. Right, dates, 1900, and people usually go with 1900 to 1914, I would say, right? That's a fairly well-known era in American history. Again, you probably had a unit on it in 9th grade. This is a period of increasing regulation and increasing government involvement in the U.S. economy, for better or for worse. This government involvement took a couple of famous forms. One of this was more increased regulation of business. You see, the Progressive Era refers to the progressive movement, which was essentially a middle-class reform movement in the United States, although there's something similar going on in Britain at the same time. And there were a lot of areas that people attempted to reform, housing, women's suffrage was part of this as well. So this wasn't just all about business and economics, but the, reform in economics, often through government regulation, was certainly one of the main foci of the Progressive Era. Okay. Well, as I said, one thing that happens is the government gets more active in regulating business. And maybe the most famous manifestation of this is the formation of some new and really quite famous and powerful regulatory agencies that occurred. See, really before this, you didn't see much in the way of government regulation of business. So these were really kind of path-breaking organizations that we now take for granted. But at any rate, here are a couple of famous names. One of these, right, the FDA. Oops, here we go. Right, still around, still in the news a lot. FDA stands for the Food and Drug Administration. And it was established around this time to really try to ensure the purity and effectiveness of food and drugs that were commercially produced. This agency is still in the news these days because generating a vaccine for the coronavirus is something that has to be overseen by and approved by the FDA. So it's still a big deal. It wasn't the only agency set up at that time, so another pretty big one, not as famous as the FDA, but still pretty important, was the FTC, which is still around, Federal Trade Commission. And this, this regulates interstate commerce in the United States. So some big company, for example, is conducting maybe business in a fraudulent way, and it's doing this on really a national scale from one state to another. That's where the FTC gets involved in that. So, okay, so that was one really substantial increase in government involvement in the U.S. economy during the Progressive Era, the rise of numerous large and eventually pretty powerful regulatory agencies. But then something even more famous happens during the Progressive Era, and this occurs in 1913 with the establishment of the very famous, and some would say infamous, federal income. 1913. Yeah, you've all heard of this, the income tax. Your parents may complain about it or talk about it or worry about it or whatever. But yeah, that's that tax that every person has to file tax reforms, or every sort of adult wage earner in the U.S. has to file tax forms sort of by April 15th, typically, right? And before 1913, though, that simply didn't exist, but it did subsequently, and it does right up to this day, and it's a pretty big deal. So it was a real watershed. Okay, so as you can see, the government really steps into some new areas and does some new things, for better or worse. A couple of pretty famous presidents are associated with this. Probably most famous president associated with this was Theodore Roosevelt. He was a member of the Republican Party, but a member of its progressive wing. He was a real champion of a lot of these causes, and indeed the FDA was certainly something that I know he was very much behind that. He's alleged to have been reading this very famous novel by, I think it's Upton Sinclair, I think, The Jungle, which was about meat packing and how unsanitary it was and things like that. And Theodore Roosevelt supposedly was in the middle of the book and was so shocked by it, he put the book down and got on the phone and went about starting to found the FDA. So anyway, he's probably the most famous progressive in American history. But there was another president who came a little while after him, Woodrow Wilson. Progressive. He was elected, in fact, in 1912 as a progressive. Now, he was actually a member of the Democratic Party, but it had a progressive wing also. And so he, again, was elected for president as a Democrat, but was a progressive. And he's more famous for what I'm going to talk about in just a moment, which is being president of the United States during World War I. But he really made his name and came to power as a progressive member of the Democratic Party. Well, so that's just a little bit about the Progressive Era. We'll move on to another big event in the story of changing government involvement in the U.S. economy, and that is World War I, which, its dates, generally people say its dates are 1914 to 1918, and that's a pretty good set of dates because World War I does start in 1914. However, you can also look at 1917 to 1918 because the United States does not join the war until 1917. But we were really involved in the war in any number of ways, especially economically, pretty much from the beginning of the war. So I think really it affected the United States economy throughout the 4 years rather than just during the last 2 years or so. Well, this also is a period of increasing government involvement in the economy. Now, this takes, again, a couple of different forms. One thing that happens is, during the war and in the period running up to the war, when the U.S. is preparing for the likely entry into the war, the United States government just gets involved in the economy by buying a huge amount of stuff as it takes on this unprecedented expansion of the United States military. So we're buying all kinds of things. We're buying rifles and bullets and uniforms, all that kind of stuff. Okay, because you have to remember that that was really the biggest war effort in the history of the world ever, and so it really was a big deal. So there's, you know, government purchases. I'm going to give that an exclamation point just because there were such big purchases, but also returning back to the progressive era, you also see, I guess, government, you know, regulation of the economy. This took the form of doing things like maybe regulating prices, for example. This is something that the United States government regulated, for example, railroad prices, manipulated them to ensure that sort of war production would be encouraged. And again, the transportation of goods for the war effort would get priority. So prices were regulated. Some goods were rationed. Something else that happens that I'm not sure, strictly speaking, I call it regulation of the economy, but it definitely should be up there, is government nationalizations of businesses. Going back to the railroads, right? Railroads in the United States were privately owned. Well, not during World War II, right? At some point during the war, the United States government just simply took over the railroads, made them sort of effectively the property of the government, and then ran the railroads, again, with the idea of optimizing the transportation of material for the war effort. So there's, you know, that's a little bit about that. As I mentioned already, the president who's most famously associated with World War I was Woodrow Wilson. He was president when the war began. He was president when the U.S. joined the war. In fact, he signed our declaration of war that had been passed by Congress, and he was, you know, famous for being involved in 1919 in the treaty ending World War I as well at Versailles. So there you are. So that's our second period. And observe that both of those were periods of expanding government involvement in the United States economy. But we come to our next period, which is known often, and you may have heard this term in ninth grade, as the period of the era of normalcy, right? And this pretty much overlaps with the 1920s. This is a period of retreat by government from the economy. The role of government in the U.S. economy will shrink during this time. Okay, driving normalcy in general, and I think also driving this tendency to reduce government involvement was the idea of trying to get back to normal after the war was over. For a lot of people, the war was something that was seen as kind of temporary rather than as something that would bring permanent changes. Now, it did bring permanent changes, but there were plenty of people who, when the war was over, said, we don't really want permanent changes. We want to go back to the old days. We want to go back to what was at one time seen as normal. So that's where normalcy comes from. And to some extent, this happened. I mean, one thing that happens, obviously, is that government purchases, you know, fall dramatically because so much of government purchases have been driven for the war effort. The war effort ends. So guess what? They're not buying scads of rifles and bullets and uniforms and all that stuff. So that's the main way in which the government's role in the economy shrank, was they just stopped buying all this stuff. Now, there were additionally, something else happens. You see an effort to roll back progressive initiatives, and progressive, let's spell it right. Lots of people liked the progressive era. Lots of people were for those reforms, but the fact is there were plenty of people who didn't like those reforms either. And when they got sort of into power, which happens, you got So I guess you might call them conservative Republican presidents in the 1920s. And they undertook to undo a number of the progressive reforms that had been passed. That, however, wasn't particularly successful, right? Those reforms proved sufficiently popular that efforts to get rid of them, I think, largely failed. I don't think they completely failed, but for example, the income tax stays around. So this was like maybe a partial retreat by the government from involvement in the U.S. economy. There are a couple of presidents associated with normalcy, but just to keep things simple, I'm going to stick to one of them. And you may have heard of this guy, maybe not. He's not one of our more famous presidents, but maybe, well, I'm sure you've heard of him, but you probably don't remember. This was a guy named Calvin Coolidge. And he served like one term as president in the mid-1920s. He was a quiet, organized guy, wanted to keep things smooth. His campaign model was keep cool with Cal. He's probably most famous among the general public for the fact that he's known to have slept, I think, 12 hours a day, typically while president, and added to that got in typically a nap as well. So probably the most well-rested president we've ever had. He actually wasn't lazy, and he's regarded as having been a pretty hardworking and good president. He just made sure, though, that that he was well-rested. I believe he also installed a bowling alley in the White House too. So maybe he was a little bit lazy now and then, but yeah, a guy who appreciated the value of a good night's sleep, and don't we all? Okay, well, that's hopefully a little bit amusing, but just observe here. So, you know, kind of a retreat by the government from the economy. Now, after the 1920s comes, of course, the 1930s, and when you think 1930s, you think the Great Depression, because that followed on the stock market crash of 1929 and lasted really pretty much throughout the 1930s. And specifically, you think of the New Deal, right? I mean, that's so famous. You guys not only heard about that in ninth grade, but I'm sure you remember a little bit about it. Right. And I mean, the New Deal was first and foremost a response to the Great Depression, as I'm sure you know. A lot of businesses went bankrupt. An awful lot of people lost their jobs, and then the business climate stayed sluggish, and unemployment stayed high for some time afterwards. And the New Deal was largely a response to the Great Depression, and it was largely an effort to end the Depression and start a recovery. So that's one way to look at the New Deal, right? End the Depression and start a recovery. That was the objective, or an objective, a major objective, probably the major objective, okay? And here we see something that was basically new and really seemed quite revolutionary at its time. And this was an effort to use government spending to stimulate the economy. And this is not, I mean, again, I think you guys have heard about this and are already a little bit familiar with this idea already. But back then, that was seen as really pretty new stuff, pretty daring stuff. This is often referred to as, you know, policy, i.e., in other words, fiscal policy. We'll look at this later on, maybe in the spring. We'll look at the economics of fiscal policy a little bit. Yeah, but this is where you've heard of things like, you know, constructing the Hoover Dam, for example, right? The idea was that if you built this great big dam, you'd have to hire a lot of people and put them to work and pay them money, and then they'd take that money and they'd spend it on things like food and clothing and houses, and that would stimulate businesses, and that would bring businesses back. And the idea was that you could just kind of, you know, again, trigger a recovery using government spending as a stimulus. All right. So know that. And the other thing that I want to say about this idea of government spending as a stimulus, that is fiscal policy, is that it's associated with a very famous economist, one of the most famous economists of all time, and you definitely should know his name. John Maynard Keynes. Okay, a British economist who was active at this time, as you might expect, and he really, I guess you could say, developed and articulated this idea. Okay, and as such, he provided sort of the intellectual foundations of the policy. Okay, as I said, he was not an American. He was British, so he wasn't part of the United States government, but his ideas, which he was, really promulgating in Britain for the most part, and with regard to what was going on in Europe, nevertheless became quite well known in the United States and really very influential. And in fact, this approach to economics, which is known as Keynesian economics, really became so widely accepted for the next several decades that pretty much it became just kind of the normal way of looking at how you manage an economy was to do this. So, okay. So that's all famous stuff, but do be aware that beyond that, right, when the United States government was pushing the New Deal, I think first and foremost it was with the idea of ending the Depression and starting recovery. But however, to some extent, though, it was also about fighting poverty in general, long term. Yeah, all these New Deal initiatives and programs weren't just about ending the Depression. Some of them were intended to be about sort of more than that, as I say here, about poverty, fighting poverty in general, long term, even after a Depression ends. Okay. So, for example, a very famous piece of New Deal legislation, the Social Security program. Okay, right, which is essentially old age pensions for Americans. It's paid for by taxes and really run by the government. That's generated during the New Deal. It's part of the New Deal, but I think it was really more about just trying to fight poverty and old age in general, right, rather than just something that was about ending the Depression. So be aware on that. Something else I want you to be aware of, in addition to government spending, right, you also see regulation. Right? And yeah, this is something that the people orchestrating the New Deal did to fight poverty and end the Depression. And a very famous example of this occurs. Do I have a date for it? I don't have a date for it, but this is, I'll just give you this. It's a law. It's called Glass-Steagall, and this was a law passed, I think, in early 1932, that to regulate banking and to make banks more safe, so that people would trust banks, because bank failures were part of what triggered the Great Depression. And the Glass-Steagall set very strict laws about what banks could and could not do in order to keep banks from making too many risky loans and other practices as well. And this piece of legislation was around really for almost the rest of the 20th century. Very influential law. So, all right. And the New Deal's important. So as you can see, I've got quite a bit to say about it. What else can I say about the New Deal here? Let's see. Impact. Right. Impact of the New Deal is a little bit questionable. Okay. Principally established to end the Depression, but it didn't do that. As you probably know, it failed to end the Depression, right? It really wasn't until World War II came along that the Depression ended. But I think that a lot of people feel that the New Deal was important in a number of ways anyway. The New Deal gave a lot of Americans hope during the Depression. They saw that the United States government was taking dramatic action to try to help them, and that was something that I think was very important to a lot of people. Not everybody liked the New Deal, but a lot of people liked it. I think also it probably made the Depression less severe, although I really shouldn't say that as a fact. That's just my understanding. Okay. But one thing that is true about the New Deal and its impact, one thing that is unquestionably true, is that it greatly and permanently increased the role that the U.S. government plays in the economy, right? A lot of things that the U.S. government does today that are part of the economy that we just take for granted date to the New Deal. It was really a watershed in this topic. The president who's associated with all of this is, of course, and again, this is something that's so well known, you not only have heard about it before, but like good Roper kids have probably remembered it. So, okay. So very famous, very important. You know, people have different opinions about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, but it certainly was influential. And I think there are certainly, you know, very compelling arguments to be made that it was that it did do some good. Although, you know, again, I'm not sure everybody would agree with that, but a lot of people would. Okay. Well, you know, the New Deal and the Depression takes us sort of right up to 1939, and then with something even maybe bigger and more powerful happens, and that's World War II. Right? You know, I'll do this. Maybe parentheses, 1939, 1945, often accepted as dates for World War II, although you can quibble with this, right? And then, though, I'm going to give you another pair of dates, 1941. 1945. Okay, right, and because the United States doesn't enter the war until December of 1941, and so I'm focusing on the U.S. But like World War I, World War II was affecting the U.S. economy and U.S. government involvement in the economy even before we had formally entered the war. Really, the impact of World War II and all of this is very similar to that of World War I. It's just bigger. So before, you know, the U.S. government made a lot of purchases for the war effort, well, that happens again in World War II on an even larger scale. Regulation in the form of, you know, setting prices and rationing and things like that occur once again, but on a much larger scale. You see, you know, more nationalizations on a larger scale as well. Like I said, it's pretty much World War I all over again, except bigger. And the president is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Primarily, right? Although, of course, he died in, I believe it was late 1944, maybe it was maybe early 1945, and was, you know, towards the end of the war, the last few months of the war, the U.S. is governed by President Harry Truman, as you probably know. But really, FDR really just sort of dominated this event. So, okay. Now, okay, so we're a little more than halfway through our lecture here, and I got to make sure that I don't dawdle. I gotta move along pretty briskly here. I got three more things to present. I'm gonna try to kind of speed up the pace a little bit. So here we go. Next period, I don't have a clever name for it. I just call it the 1950s. It's kind of like normalcy, right? The war has ended, and well, first off, of course, there's a tendency, you know, government purchases fall. Okay, that does happen. There's no question about that. It happens pretty dramatically, in fact. Okay. There is talk, efforts to roll back, this time, the New Deal, not progressive era stuff, but New Deal legislation. Okay. So again, that's very similar to normalcy, right? But well, let's see. What do I have to say here? Well, the New Deal pretty much survives this. I mean, a few things did get rolled back, but for the most part, the New Deal, whether you like it or don't like it, that is basically what happened. It got trimmed back a little bit, but New Deal programs that things like Social Security that have been established stay around because, you know, popular. People basically like things like Social Security to this day. It's a very popular sort of American social welfare program. So efforts to roll back the New Deal didn't really fail. Most of the stuff that's established during the New Deal survives. Now, government purchases do fall, but and they do fall, and they fall by quite a bit, but not by as much as some people wanted them to. I guess what you might call more conservative elements wanted to really go back to the way things were before World War II. But what happens is government purchases, basically for military things, fall a lot, but some new, what do I want to say, causes of big spending arise. Okay, so World War II ends, but World War II is replaced by not another world war, but it is replaced by the Cold War. It's not as expensive as World War II, but still very expensive. So this is part of that idea that the government spending on military stuff did fall very dramatically, but it didn't fall as nearly as far as some people wanted it to, because the Cold War picks up and we end up spending a lot of money keeping up with the Russians. Okay, not as much as if we'd gone to war with them, but we did spend a lot of money. And there are some other big projects as well that are undertaken. One of these you guys are all familiar with because you've driven around on it. Or at least been in cars when other people are driving around on it. And this is the interstate highway system, which actually was part of the Cold War to some extent. Okay, but that was a huge spending project. We spent billions of dollars building these super highways all over the country. Okay, there were a couple of other pretty big projects too, but the Cold War was the biggest. The interstate highway system was really big as well. So yeah, government retreats, but not completely, not completely. President associated most with this is President Dwight Eisenhower. Republican, so, but not real conservative. You might even call him a moderate Republican. Elected in 1952 and then re-elected in 1956. So really very much president throughout most of the period. Okay, two more periods to look at. Okay, I'm going to go with mid-1960s. Well, that's not, I'm not going to title it. I'm going to War on Poverty. That's really the name for this initiative, okay? And this occurs, it's associated with the mid-1960s. And this is a phase, a period of, once again, government involvement in the economy. And this is done with the objective of fighting poverty. And indeed, some people were actually trying to eliminate poverty. The mid-1960s was a period of considerable optimism in the United States. In fact, really the post-World War II period on up into this period was a period of considerable optimism. You know, the United States had kind of gone off to war and won the war, and that had ended the Depression. And then, as you may know, the period after World War II in the United States was a period of strong and long economic recovery and growth, and pretty much everybody in America was getting, incomes were rising generally for most Americans. Standards of living were rising for most Americans. And so it was kind of in this climate of a number of really sort of American successes and achievements that some people were thinking not only that you could and should fight poverty, maybe have some success at reducing it, but it wasn't that hard to find people who thought that you could just get rid of it in the United States and could do it pretty quickly and easily too. Now, that may sound naive to you guys, or maybe it doesn't, but a lot of people did think that way. So anyway, naive or not, there were efforts to do this, and really the efforts of the war on poverty were often patterned after the New Deal. So one thing that happens is you see existing anti-poverty programs expanded. So for example, we see Medicare, okay, established. So Medicare really emerges in the mid-1960s. You'll recall that's basically government health insurance for the elderly, okay? And the thing is that Medicare was established really as a supplement to Social Security, right? So Social Security is established and then Medicare is added on to that. It's seen kind of as sort of building on the foundations of the New Deal. Okay, so you see that. Meanwhile, there were other simply new programs. So, for example, you get. I don't want to go into too much detail here because I want to move along quickly. But just trust me. What was known? Well, I guess I will do this. AFDC. This is maybe a very famous welfare program. This was a program just giving financial aid to low-income families. Okay, this was really new. This was not something that was really patterned or based on a New Deal program. It was in the spirit of the New Deal, but it was a genuinely new program. Okay, and this, by the way, AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. That's what it stands for. Aid to Families with Dependent Children was what eventually transforms into TANF, which I talked about in my lecture on anti-poverty programs today. So, all right. Results? Well, you know, there appear to have been some significant results. One of the things that happens, right? You know, shortly after these programs get underway is that the poverty rate drops from 15% to about 12%. Before the war on poverty, the norm was for about 15% of Americans to live in poverty. After the war on poverty, that drops to about 12%, and it stayed at about 12% pretty much up to this day. It goes up and down, but it tends to hover around 12%. So that looks like the war on poverty caused a significant drop in poverty, and it may have done that. It may have done that. Now it's tricky because also the economy continued to grow, and so it may be economic growth rather than the war on poverty that contributed or caused this. I don't think anybody really knows for sure, but this poverty rate did drop, and it's likely that the war on poverty either caused that reduction in poverty or at least contributed to it significantly. And I'd like you guys to know that. But observe, though, poverty did not go away. No, far from it. You know, far from it. Okay, so the folks who thought, you know, we're just gonna get rid of poverty in America, unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. But there you go. The president who's associated with this, and this is a pretty famous thing to know, and I really would like you to know this guy's name, and that he's very much associated with the war on poverty, was Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, right? President Johnson, Democrat from Texas, who was, well, famous for this, as well as quite a number of other very famous and important reforms. You know, there's a lot of really landmark civil rights legislation occurred under his presidency as well. Okay. Well, the last period that I want to look at from the 20th century, and I don't know if we'll get to a few remarks about the 21st century, but at least we can wrap up. The 20th century, as far as I'm going to take it, occurs in the 1980s with what is often referred to as the Reagan Revolution, right? 1980s, right? Okay. This is, as you may know already from talking to your parents, etc., this is a period of reducing government, right? Of trying to, you know, again, restrict government involvement in the economy to withdraw government from the economy, right? So it's an about face, okay? This is caused by a number of things. One of the things is that The war on poverty, while probably partially successful, right, was not nearly as successful as a lot of people thought it was going to be. So I think one reason was that by the 1980s, some people had become kind of disillusioned with this idea that government can fix the economy or can make a really big difference in the economy. So that was partly because the war on poverty hadn't been as successful as many people thought it would be. Then people said, well, maybe that approach doesn't work very well. So that's one reason for this decision to kind of change and kind of, and reduce government involvement in the economy. Additionally, so what do I want to say here? Successful. And that kind of undermined the faith in using government to fight poverty. Also, yeah, the 1970s were kind of tough times economically, and this made at least some people sort of more conservative, especially like middle class people had to pay taxes. And they found now that they were having kind of a tough time maintaining their living standards and their lifestyles that they had grown accustomed to. And so the idea of perhaps cutting taxes sounded very appealing. I mean, it's always at least a little bit appealing, but lots of people were saying, look, we could really use a tax cut right now. There's a lot of inflation, and gee, the war on poverty didn't look like it was so successful as either. So those high taxes that funded the war on poverty maybe weren't very effective. Okay. So that happens, and related to this, you get a new economist, a sort of a man of his era, and this is a guy named Milton Friedman. He was an American economist associated largely with the University of Chicago, and he was someone who was, brilliant guy, brilliant economist, Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he made arguments that less government was actually more effective, that shrinking government was really a better way to run the economy, and that right, and then a lot of Keynes's ideas had problems with them, and the Keynesian approach to using fiscal policy to manage the economy was not very effective. And in the 1980s, and I lived through this as a young man, Friedman's ideas became very widely accepted, and Keynesian economics really fell out of favor during the 80s, the 90s, during the aughts, really on up until around 2008 or so. So anyway, so you wear that. So Milton Friedman here is kind of like sort of the guy who provided the intellectual foundations for the Reagan Revolution, which was a big reduction in government involvement in the economy. Okay, so impact. Well, hard to know for sure. A couple of things are certain. One thing that did happen was, taxes were cut. That definitely happened. There's no question about this. Ronald Reagan, who was the president at the time, cut taxes really quite substantially. And that was definitely popular with a lot of people, not everybody, but that happened. But of course, that's politically always kind of an easy thing to do because, generally people don't like paying taxes. And, so it wasn't that big of an accomplishment, but he did promise to do it, and he did get it done. Now, something else, though, that he wanted to do was to he wanted to cut social welfare programs. That was another promise. He said we're gonna cut taxes and we're gonna cut spending. Cut spending, and that was not very successful. Not very, in the sense that he was not able to do that politically. He wanted to have pretty deep cuts in spending, especially on social welfare programs, but that didn't happen because, not surprisingly, social welfare programs tend to be politically fairly popular with not with everybody, but with a fair number of people, especially Social Security. So he was not very successful. Limited cuts only occurred. But he was fairly successful at deregulating. That was something that things like banking, communications, radio, television, things like that, right? You know, successful. That is, he was successful at doing these things. The Ronald Reagan's presidency was successful at deregulating the economy quite a bit. And the fact is, you know, there was in fact an economic boom. You know, starting in the mid-'80s. Now, again, just like you can't be certain that the war on poverty lowered the poverty rate, maybe it did. I wouldn't be surprised if it did, but we can't be certain. Likewise, I don't think you can be certain that the Reagan Revolution triggered this long and quite strong economic boom in the 1980s. Maybe it did. There's no question that it might have, but there were other things going on in the economy as well that may be responsible for this. So, for example, one thing that's going on is this is really when the computer revolution occurs, this whole business of people owning their own computers. That really started to kick in around this time, and that just generated this enormous new industry that grew very rapidly and was tremendous. You know, huge amounts of money were made really off the invention and development and marketing of computers. So it's hard to tell exactly what caused the boom. But at any rate, it was a really quite a significant event. It was a period of some substantial reductions in government involvement in the economy. And as I said, Keynesian economics really went out of fashion for a couple of decades here, and Friedman's ideas of limited government were much more popular. And that really lasted, I'm going to go maybe a minute over or so, into the 21st century, when you had the 2008 recession, sometimes called, the Great, not Depression, but the Great Recession. And that was, as you probably know, a very severe recession, really the probably just about the worst one that had happened since the Great Depression. And that was so severe that lots of people said, look, we've got to get the government to do something. We need to have stimulus packages and things like that. And to some extent, the presidents, both, well, especially notably President Obama, did just that. And again, the recession ended. I don't know whether or not the stimulus packages were behind that or not. Again, that's something economists debate. They probably did help end that recession, but that takes us up to today. And now Keynesian economics, or also fiscal policy, are again enjoy more prestige than they had back in the 1980s and 90s, et cetera. So I've gone a little bit over my 45 minutes, but there's all kinds of stuff to say, and I could keep talking. But instead, I'm going to get out of the screen share. I'm going to wish everybody a good night. I'm going to go do the dishes, and I'm going to curl up in my bed just like a squirrel in a nest, and I'm going to get some sleep. And I'll see you guys actually on Tuesday, not tomorrow, but on Tuesday. So see you then.